Hello and welcome to Saturday Agenda. I'm Peter van Onselen. Well, the two big issues that are dominating events at the moment, certainly the biggest one is the international downturn in the market. There's been a slight improvement overnight, but the Australian market was hit hard yesterday, and the expectation is that it will continue throughout next week and maybe even for the foreseeable future. To discuss that issue, I'm joined here as I am each week by Dr. Greg O'Mahony. Thanks for your company.
Pete. Pleasure to be here.
And we're joined out of Perth by the Shadow Assistant Treasurer, Matthias Cormann. Senator Matthias Cormann, thanks for your company.
Good to be here.
Now, I said that there are two issues, and I've highlighted the global financial meltdown, if you could call it that. That might be a little too strong. But the other one is the Liberal Party meltdown between your former colleague Nick Minchin and your current colleague Malcolm Turnbull. It seems like every weekend, Senator, when we come on this show, we're talking about some sort of ructions that involve Mr Turnbull. But what's your view on this? Who is right in this particular stoush? Your former close factional ally Nick Minchin or your current fellow frontbencher Malcolm Turnbull?
Look, Peter, I think you're overstating things a little bit here. Yes, there's been some debates this week, but to start talking about meltdown, I think, is exaggerating things a bit on each count. So, I mean,
but it is a meltdown for Nick Minchin to decide to write an open letter to the newspaper condemning Malcolm Turnbull and telling him to get over the fact that he lost the leadership some time ago back in 2009. I mean, that is unhelpful, you'd at least say.
Well, look, as my very good friend and colleague Joe Hockey said yesterday, Nick Minchin is a private citizen and he's entitled to his views. I mean, I've got a very simple rule for myself. Joe Hockey also said it was unhelpful. Well, I've got a very simple rule for myself. We've got a very bad and incompetent government in Canberra, the worst government in the history of the Commonwealth. So all of us, we've got a job to do. And the test for myself and the rule for myself is, before I say something, is this going to help us put pressure on this government to perform better for the Australian people? Is this going to help us defeat this government at the next election? And if it does, I will go ahead and talk about it. And if it doesn't, I hold my own counsel. So, you know, this is why I go. I think we've got a responsibility on behalf of the Australian people to do everything we can to hold this government to account, to put them under pressure to perform better, and to defeat them at the earliest opportunity. So that's what I'm focused on.
Senator, on some level you've had some degree of success with that over the last few months. Something like this, though, the re-emergence of this Turnbull issue, if I could call it that, is clearly bad news and bad timing for you. That there were suggestions yesterday from Peter Reith that what you say Nick Minchin's a private citizen, Peter Reith's saying he's trying to create a national conservative alliance, a right faction for the party. Is that a concern for you?
Well, I mean, I don't. I mean, I let Peter Reith make his own comments, but I mean, essentially, we are very focused on holding a very bad government to account. We are very focused on putting pressure on this government to perform better in what are very uncertain times internationally. We are obviously putting this government under pressure over its broken promise in relation to the carbon tax, which is also sapping household and business confidence right now, right across Australia. I mean, we've got serious jobs to do, and talking to ourselves and looking at ourselves is not what the Australian people expect us to do right now.
Senator, look, I realise that is certainly the case, but we have to be realistic here. We will talk about the government in a moment. I really want to spend some time talking about how on earth they're going to get back to surplus given some of the economic conditions out there. But it is reasonable before doing so in the first part of this to ask you quite a bit about this stoush, because you were named in one of the reports yesterday as one of the key factional lieutenants to Nick Minchin. It was yourself and Corey Bernardi that were named as the actual power brokers sitting underneath your Senate leader, Eric Abetz. So this is an issue that I'm interested in pursuing. Do you see there has been the kind of conservative factional divide that Malcolm Turnbull thinks there is? Do you agree with Nick Minchin that is not the case?
Well, I don't think there is a factional divide, and I don't think that Malcolm Turnbull has been talking about a factional divide, incidentally. I mean, the Liberal Party is very united behind Tony Abbott. We've been doing a very good job holding this government to account, and we will continue to do so. I mean, as for myself, I'm just a humble senator from Western Australia, Peter. I'm here trying to do my job as part of as the Shadow Assistant Treasurer, as part of the coalition team. I mean, I'm focusing on doing my bit to hold this very bad government to account, and that's what I'll continue to focus on.
Senator, what about another humble member of the coalition, Barnaby Joyce? A few times over the last few weeks he's called for Malcolm Turnbull to exercise more quote-unquote self-control. Is Barnaby Joyce someone, to your mind, who has credibility on the subject of self-control?
Well, look, I mean, as I've said, like, there's a very simple rule. We've got a very bad government in Canberra. We've got a job to do to put them under pressure to perform better. We've got a job to do to get them out of government as quickly as possible, so that they cannot continue to put this much damage onto the Australian economy. Look, it's very simple. We've got a job to do, and all of us should focus on the government. I don't think it's helpful for any of us to talk to each other through the media, so I will continue to focus on the flaws of this government.
Can I ask, I mean, you know, taking a step back for a moment, a serious question about what you think Malcolm Turnbull can do, because I've got some sympathy for him in this current situation. He's getting accused of going off message by some people. He's getting accused of causing deliberate problems in some of his rhetoric. But at the end of the day, what's he supposed to do when journalists keep asking him about the leadership, they keep asking him about climate change? He's not going to just sit there and say nothing. He's not a robot. He's going to answer the question. And quite frankly, as you've said on this program previously, Senator, when you actually read through the transcript details of what he said, he hasn't often been stirring anywhere near as much as he gets accused of. What is he supposed to do? He's in Parliament, he's part of a team, he can't not do media interviews. What would your advice be?
Well, look, I mean, clearly this whole issue is something that the Canberra Press Gallery and journalists get themselves excited about. It's not something that people across Australia get themselves excited about.
Nick Minchin gets excited about it too.
Well, people across Australia are concerned about the fact that the carbon tax will push up the cost of everything, will cost jobs, and all of that without doing anything to help reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. That's what people across Australia are concerned about. Look, Malcolm has got very strong views in relation to action on climate change, and of course the coalition is committed to effective action on climate change. We've got a policy in place that is way more effective than what the Labor Party has put forward. The Labor Party is putting, and Malcolm agrees with that, incidentally. Malcolm agrees that the carbon tax is very bad policy, and Malcolm is entirely supportive of our direct action policy.
Senator, if we're just changing tack for a moment, it would be interesting to have your thoughts on the events.
When are we going to talk about the economy?
We're about to do it right now.
Of trying, Senator.
We're about to do it right now, Senator. The events of the last few days. It'd be fascinating to hear your thoughts. A lot of people are saying that this could be much worse than the first time round, in the sense that where it matters, governments have run out of stimulus bullets. Interest rates in Europe and the US are already at 0.5%, so that you don't have central banks with the levers that they had a few years ago to pull. You're a man with a financial background. How are you seeing it, and how concerned are you for the Australian economy?
Well, look, I mean, clearly there is a lot of international uncertainty now, driven by the sovereign debt situation in Europe and the US. And I mean, what you say is right. The monetary policy in parts of Europe and in the US is pretty well at its limit. We've got record low levels of interest rates. You've got the US is printing money. Obviously, their fiscal situation is at a stretch. You see, I mean, this is part of the reason why we were so critical of what the Rudd government did in the context of the last global economic downturn, because I just looked to the US and to the UK and decided to spend a lot of money through fiscal stimulus when our situation was quite different. This government inherited a budget that was in surplus. We had no government net debt, and of course the government put a lot of money into the economy very quickly here in Australia, when really our interest rates were comparatively high, and of course in Australia our interest rates bottomed out at 3% and have now gone up to 4.75% very, very quickly, when in other parts of the world that hasn't been the case. There was much more scope for the Reserve Bank to stimulate the economy further at that time without the need to go that far into debt, which would have meant that we would have been in a much stronger position now. Really what we need the government to stop its wasteful spending, to start bringing back those levels of debt, and to take pressure off interest rates into the future.
Senator, can I ask you, I mean, we're all aware of the situation in Greece. It's been bailed out by the EU, Germany in particular. There's talk of the need for another bailout. It's running at 125% debt in the context of its GDP. There's a lot of talk that it could default, and that the default in Greece could spread more broadly than that. Do you agree with your Shadow Treasurer, Joe Hockey, when he says that in global terms Greece hasn't got much debt? That's what he told Melbourne Radio yesterday.
Well, look, I mean, clearly there are concerns in Europe around Greece. I mean, they're well documented, and I mean, Italy is obviously now increasingly a concern. And we've
but
got
are you concerned that the alternative
US
treasurer doesn't think Greece has much debt?
I haven't seen those comments. I'm not.
Well, I'll read it to you word for word. He says he's talking to John Fain on ABC Radio in Melbourne, one of the high-rating shows there, and he was asked about the level of debt in Australia, and he talked about how there's net debt of 110 billion, and we're running a deficit this year in excess of 20 billion. John Fain interrupted him and said neither of which are significant in global terms. Hockey said no, they are significant. They are significant. Fain interrupted him again and said in global terms we have a fraction of the debt, and then he got interrupted again, and Hockey said yeah, but you know what, in global terms Greece hasn't got much debt. It's a question of what they have got the capacity to pay. Well, actually, Greece doesn't have the capacity to pay its debt. It's at 125% of GDP. That's the problem.
Well, I mean, the only reason why we are in a better position in Australia is because, of course, this government inherited a no government net debt position back in 2007. You've got to remember, like, we inherited a fiscal mess back in 1996, and by 2007 had sorted our fiscal situation out. And now, of course, Labor very, very quickly is putting us back into a fiscal mess. Like this time last year, we were looking at $94 billion worth of government net debt. That's now gone up to in excess of $110 billion worth of government net debt. The carbon tax itself is going to put us $6 to $7 billion further into the red. I mean, only the Labor Party can come up with a multi-billion-dollar new tax that is going to put us further into the red. We're going to have to spend more than $26 billion in interest payments just to service the debt over the current forward estimates. I mean, so if you look at where we came from, a situation of no government net debt, and now in a situation where we are accelerating things at a time when we should not be this far in debt if the government had managed our public finances more carefully.
Senator, despite everything you just said, we are in relatively a better position to the US and Europe. Just casting...
Thanks to John Howard and Peter Costello doing the hard yards.
I'm sure they're grateful to hear you say that.
Well, that's true.
Looking for a moment, I agree with you, looking for a moment to the US, do you agree, as someone said this week, that if senior members of Congress were company directors, they'd all be done for insolvent trading?
Well, obviously, I can't possibly comment on a question like that. I mean, very, very, very good try. I mean, clearly, I mean, there are very complex circumstances there in the US. I mean, and the political processes in the US will work through all of that, I'm sure. And I mean, look, overnight the employment figures in the US were slightly better than had been anticipated by the market. So hopefully, that is some sign that things might be back on the up. Obviously, the situation in the US is important for us, but I mean, more important for us, I would argue, is what's happening in China. In the context of the last global economic downturn, clearly China helped us, stay in much better shape than other parts of the world, and so that is obviously very much where we've got to keep an eye on as well.
Senator Cormann, final line of questioning, and this is something that has an impact given the global circumstances on both sides of politics. You've got the Reserve Bank slashing its growth forecast. That's been referred to on the front page of the Australian today. In light of that, it's going to make it very hard for Labor to hit its target of a surplus by 2012-13. It's also going to put spending pressure on both sides of politics, isn't it, in the lead up to the next election? The promises that are in place on your side, the promises that are in place on the Labor side. What do you think this is going to mean in terms of both sides of politics needing to take a pretty close look at their sort of fiscal promises and perhaps, for example, what they need to pare back?
Look, Labor has delivered 4 successive deficit budgets. 4 budgets out of 4 were deficit budgets. Labor talks about delivering a surplus, but then delivers a deficit. And I've got no doubt that there will be, every year from here on in that Labor is in government, they will come up with yet another excuse as to why they cannot live within their means. And so, do I expect that Labor will be able to deliver a surplus in 2012-13? I've got serious doubts about it, because if you look at Labor's track record so far, they haven't been able to live within their means. And I'm sure, I mean, look, you've always got challenges in the economy. You've always got international challenges you've got to deal with. But the key is to stop the wasteful spending and to actually focus on living within your means. And that is something, if you look at the coalition's track record, that is something that we've got a track record of doing. And I think people across Australia know that it is always the Labor Party who stuffs things up with our public finances, and there's always the coalition that's got to come in and fix things up again.
What is it about politicians? When you say final question, it always becomes the longest answer of the entire interview. Senator Cormann, Shadow Assistant Treasurer, we do appreciate you joining us on Saturday Agenda. Thanks very much for your company.
Thanks, Senator.
Good to be here.
And Senator, I might also let you know before we go to the break that you might want to tune in for Australian Agenda tomorrow, because we've got live in the studio one Malcolm Turnbull, so it might be worth watching.
Looking forward to it.
All right, thanks very much. You're watching Saturday Agenda. We will be back from this break in a moment.